We'll get started here momentarily. Can we go over there?
It's kind of crooked.
Oh, yeah, is it crooked?
Like incredibly so.
Turn the projector.
Move it back.
It went from bad to worse.
Yeah. He mentioned this has to go to the left.
Need to change.
You need to change. You have to talk.
Whatever. How many hackers does it take to fix a fucking projector?
It's not like It was, I think it was lined up yesterday.
What are you saying? That's the way
Was it? I've been shooting it like this. I guess I've been too lazy to try to figure it out.
It would be a very simple.
Well, I mean, I just had to bring them a little bit later, but anyway, let me get started with the talk. Okay, so hello everyone, my name is Michael Rash. I'm the security architect of Authorization networks. Today I want to talk about my open source work, in particular the FWNOT project, which is open source. You can download it at cypherdyne.org. And generally I try to give pretty technical talks. If you have any questions though throughout, please interrupt me. I don't mind taking questions all the time. And I'd like to just to be a little bit more interactive if you like. So why another talk about port knocking and SPA? I think that there's not really very much consensus yet in the security community about whether or not this technology is actually useful. And I think that trying to get the message out is always a good thing. And I also look forward to feedback from the community about whether or not the technology is used by you folks out there or not. We're going to talk about some practical security trade-offs. If you've seen any of my previous talks, you'll find that I've emphasized previously the advantages of SPA over port knocking because of some built-in characteristics that port knocking has with respect to limitations in the protocol. There is one good advantage, however, of port knocking over SPA, and that is that port knocking can be implemented via less complex mechanisms. And because complexity breeds insecurity, I think that there's still going to be a place for port knocking as well. This talk is to try to educate you about, if you don't already know, that is about some of the real differences between the two mechanisms. Also, people tend to concentrate on detecting port knocking or SPA in use on a network, and they don't also offer a lot of mechanisms for breaking either of the two mechanisms. That is, it's easier to break port knocking both from a DOS and a replay perspective usually. It's harder to do the same for SPA. And in this talk, I'm going to release FWNOT 1.9.6, which is up on my website now. You can download it. And previous to this release, it's possible to write snort rules to automate the detection of SPA packets to a pretty good degree. And you'll see that the 1.9.6 release is now designed to make even that a lot more difficult. We'll talk about some real-world deployment scenarios for SSH and even HTTP, and we'll have hopefully a live demo at the end here if I can get that to work. but please again interrupt me with questions if you'd like anytime. So I'd like to just review just a little bit about what the differences between, or what port knocking and SPA really are. Of course, port knocking is the encoding of authentication information across packet headers, and typically requires multiple packets being sent to a system that's monitoring those packets passively via firewall log file typically, but you can also implement port knocking on the server side by sniffing the wire directly if you like. And I use server in a sort of a loose sense here. We're not talking about a traditional server that you would connect to, such as a TCP server. We're talking about a much more passive mechanism. But the key is that you combine this passive mechanism with an active denial of all connections to a server that you want to protect, and typically this is SSH. So you protect SSH behind a default drop packet filter, and the only TCP stacks, the only remote SSH clients that can access this SSH server through this packet filter are those that can produce a valid. Those that can produce a valid port knock or SPA sequence. I should say a port knock sequence or an SPA packet. SPA, by contrast, transmits authentication information in packet payloads instead of just in packet headers. And the goal here, of course, is to make Nmap ineffective at detecting a service that's protected in this way. I think the security community probably would agree with me that protecting a service with a kernel-level filtering mechanism, such as IP tables in the Linux kernel or IPFW in the BSD kernels, or PF, et cetera, in OpenBSD, is probably a good way to protect against any user space vulnerabilities that may exist in a user space application like SSHD. That's not to say that firewalls themselves are perfect software. They're certainly not. There have been vulnerabilities from time to time, but at least we can minimize the vulnerabilities that could potentially be exploited by an arbitrary source that's just happily scanning for SSH that is advertised to the world via TCP socket. So some people rely on software such as deny host and fail to ban to look for password guessing attempts in their SSH logs logged via syslog. That's a good strategy, at least for trying to convince you that having a good password is a good idea, but many attacks don't rely on brute forcing a password. Any of the Zalesky integer overflow exploits, the older exploits against OpenSSH, for example, are there's no password in sight, and yet you're still able to compromise SSHD. The recent Debian OpenSSL vulnerability was also a good example where passwords, again, nowhere in sight. You have reduced entropy in the generation of keys, and that affected SSH as well. So there's also the second bullet point. There was kind of an interesting article posted on the Register that talked about a new strategy for where a coordinated attack against brute forcing passwords and SSH daemons would be done via distributed systems that have all been compromised by an attacker or a set of attackers, and only 3 attempts would come from an individual system in order to try to brute force a password. And once 3 attempts have been made, the next set of attempts would come from a different IP address. It's sort of the same classic technique where you would try to slip beneath an IDS port scan threshold by reducing the number of ports that you scanned or scanning over a longer period of time, that kind of thing. So they now apply this as well to SSH password guessing attempts. So that reduces the effectiveness of trying to threshold those failed login attempts. So personally, I'm a lot more concerned about a much more damaging exploit in SSHD, and so I don't allow anyone to connect through SSH until they've generated a valid SPA packet. So is it useful? I would say yes, and we'll talk about some trends in a second. There are many competing implementations. If you look at portknocking.org, there's about 30 of them in total. It's about 5 implementations that implement SPA-style authentication, and there's about another 25 port knocking implementations. Those 5 SPA implementations do it a little bit differently from project to project. The Tumblr project uses a hash payload, for example, whereas there's a net filter module that does SPA specifically particularly within the Linux kernel itself, so there's no userland component running on the server side. And so
let's talk about some trends. You know, it's kind of hard to quantify who is running port knocking or SPA. I can't go download Nmap and scan for your port knocking instances. I mean, it's designed specifically to make that impossible. So what can we rely on? Well, I have some download statistics from my web server, cypherdyne.org. In 2006, got about nearly 3,000 downloads. 2007, that more than doubled. And so far this year, it's nearly 10,000, and this year is only about half over, so I think the trend is up. And we can also look at trends from search engines. So last month, I released a tool I called Gootrude. You can, of course, download this at the link at the end of the slide, which what it does is once per day, it sends a set of search terms into Google and takes the number of hits in Google and trends those numbers over time. And so it generates GNU plot graphs of that search, the search results data. So I wrote the first version of Gootrude about a year ago. I didn't release it because I wanted to collect some data. And so if I graph the term single packet authentication, not authorization, but authentication in this case, starting from July of last year going through July of this year, it's gone from about 200 search results in Google up to over 1,600. Single packet authorization, which is a term that FWNOP uses specifically. FWNOP does, of course, both authentication and authorization, which are not the same thing. And the trend back in July of 2007, maybe 1,000, kind of hard to even see the red on that graph, but then you get this strange sort of oscillation effect coming from Google. That's probably more an artifact of how Google builds its index versus, you know, say here in late June, a spike of 60,000 websites reference single packet authorization, and then within the next 2 days, all those, 50,000 of those websites went away in Google's index, right? So kind of interesting how Google builds its index. I wish I had Gootrude when I first released FWNOP, but I didn't until a year ago. But here's the graph of what the FWNOP term looks like. Of course, if you're involved in any open source projects or thinking of starting one, it's good to pick a unique string so you can do this kind of analysis via search engines. It's very, FWNOP is pretty unique, so it's easy to get a sense of what search engines really see it as instead of having lots of other overlapping data. So I'd say SPA usage is probably up, but widespread deployment probably has a long way to go too. If any of you have some good statistics or that you would like to discuss or share with me, I'd be really interested. Support within Linux distributions or other platforms is, I think, going to be a driver for this technology. FWNOP supports IP tables and IPFW, like I mentioned. There's also a Windows client. And there are plans to integrate it with things like the OpenWRT Linux distribution by rewriting FWNOP in C, making it much more lightweight. It's currently in Perl. And there's, I think, a really interesting open question, which is, to what extent are these technologies used by the Black Hat community? Do botnets use them? There's been some anecdotal evidence that seems to indicate that port knocking is used or has been used from time to time, but it's kind of sketchy. There isn't a lot of data there. I think this would make a great topic for a research paper. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit. Any questions so far? Yes. Oh, okay, so the question was, any plans to integrate with packet filter? You mean the PF firewall and OpenBSD? Yes, that's on the to-do list specifically. That will be done. And also plans to integrate it within the iPhone? Was that the question? I don't know much about what capabilities the iPhone has for packet filtering. Presumably it has IPFW in the kernel because it's running on Mac OS X, but I don't actually have one yet, so if you'd like to provide a development platform, I'd love to contribute. As a client. Yeah, does anyone know if Perl runs on the iPhone? Yes. Okay, well in that case, it probably would work right now. The